Hello everyone. Okay, I hope we're all well and happy. What we're going to look at today is the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and how and why that changes. Now, before we do, last time we spoke, if that's the right phrase, of our current times, I left you looking at what was meant by ministerial responsibility and what was meant by cabinet, by collective responsibility. Hopefully, you're very clear on the differences between the two. Hopefully, as well, you're a little bit aware there's a bit of a grey area as well, especially around individual ministerial responsibility. I mean, how far is a minister responsible for what happens in their department? Um, I left you finding out about why various ministers resigned. And again, if a question pops up on this, we've got a whole range of examples that you can give in essays. And remember, the example are quite like comparative examples. So, like when you're making an argument that have two examples, which might show a similarity or possibly a difference. With that said, I'm not going to go through every single one, but so I'm trying to get comfy on this chair. I'm not going to go through every single one, but you should have a range here of different factors as to why ministers resigned. So, for example, we have Robin Cook on here under the Blair government. I chose him because he's a very clear example of someone resigning over collective responsibility. He did not agree with the war in Iraq, and he left an appointed principal. You've got a number of others who left under slightly more dubious circumstances. David Laws, Chris Huhne. It's quite interesting actually under the coalition that quite a few of the ministers who had to resign were actual Liberal Democrats, which I think was quite interesting. You have Andrew Mitchell, he was a Conservative. He had resigned after criticising the police, didn't he? PC pleb, whatever it was his pusher said. Priti Patel, she's now the Home Secretary, but she had to resign in 2017. She basically tried to do her own policy in Israel. That should say Damien, not Daniel. Damon Green, Amber Rudd, she's quite interesting. She also fits in nicely about the power of departmental select committees because the Windrush scandal was kind of brewing, and then during the departmental select committee she was asked about it and she didn't really seem to be on top of her brief. So that kind of sealed her fate. And then of course we got our old friend Boris. Again, collective responsibility, does not agree with Theresa May's Brexit policy. As was true for David Davis as well. There are some I've not put on there. I mean, there's Gavin Williamson, who I should have a look at, who was basically sacked by Theresa May as Defence Secretary regarding that leak. He's now the Education Secretary. So I cannot get comfy on this chair. You missed a slight boo-boo I made as well in the last one, because I kept talking about Nigel Heseltine, and of course it's Michael Heseltine. I wasn't thinking of Nigel Farage, I don't think. Perhaps because poor old Nigel the dog on Garner's World has died, so perhaps that was on my mind. Anyway, it's Michael Heseltine. He stormed out of the cabinet under Mrs. Thatcher. So, what we're going to look at today is the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Now, if you look on the exam specification at the beginning of the booklet, it says under 3.3.1, the power of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, the factors governing the Prime Minister's selection of ministers, done. Now this is the bit we're going to look at today. The factors that affect the relationship between the Cabinet and the Prime Minister and the ways they have changed and the balance of power between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. So there's three things there, isn't there? What affects the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet? How has that relationship changed, or how does it change? And what is the balance of power between these two institutions, Prime Minister and Cabinet? So they're the three kind of main things we're going to have a look at. So with this in mind, let me go back to my page in the booklet again. At the top of the page it says relationship between the PM and Cabinet. It says Cabinet government means. So you need to find out what is meant by Cabinet government. I mean, essentially, so my phone's busy buzzing now. I mean, it's essentially. The idea is that the Prime Minister is supposed to be first amongst equals. He or she has got the power to appoint and dismiss cabinet members, and they chair meetings. But in theory, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are kind of co-equal and they kind of govern together. Now, in reality, you see a number of prime ministers who are accused of being more presidential, i.e. acting more on their own. And that's where you get this phrase presidentialism, which is on this little table. The Lynch textbook on page 145 has got quite a good definition of presidentialism, which you might want to use. Now, what I want you to do is there was a series by Michael Cockrell called Cabinet Confidential. They're not all on YouTube, rather annoyingly, but there's quite a few nice bits in this series. A little bit kind of broken up, I'm afraid, which makes it slightly more tricky. But there are some really nice bits in here regarding prime ministers and their cabinet. I mean, if you think about it, the factors which can affect prime ministers and cabinet are things like the personal style of the prime minister. Some prime ministers are very good at working with other people and are quite consensual. They like working in a team. I would possibly suggest John Major would fit into that category. Other prime ministers, though, I suppose you could say to some extent Boris Johnson as well, the way he's handled this COVID crisis, he's kind of taken, well, he was forced to take a step back through his illness, wasn't he? But even when he's kind of come back, he's allowed the ministers to take quite prominent roles in those press briefings. As I said before, a cynic would say he's done that so they're all dipping their hand in the blood if it all goes horribly wrong. But he's appearing quite consensual, isn't he, with his cabinet? They're all kind of getting involved in making those briefings, etc., etc. Other prime ministers, though, are much more kind of have a much more dominant style, much more kind of, I don't want to use the word aggressive style, but that's kind of how sometimes they come across. Mrs. Thatcher, for example, okay, she has this reputation, doesn't she, of, you know, her way or no way. I think it's on one of those videos you had to watch where someone basically says that she basically went into cabinet meetings, told them what the view was, and then they all had to argue whether they agreed with her or not. Tony Blair's often accused as well of being quite presidential in this way as well, kind of dominating his cabinet. And again, if you think about it, both of those prime ministers got certain things in common. Their personal style might be, you know, I'm right, but also they both had really big majorities, which means that they have that authority behind them. And also, of course, that both of them had kind of a clear sense of directions where they wanted to go. You had this new Labour agenda of Tony Blair, and you had obviously the Thatcherite agenda of Mrs. Thatcher. Whereas prime ministers like John Major, who are a bit more consensual, working much more with their cabinet on a more like a team basis, well, he only had a very small majority, 21 after the 1992 election, which whittled down to 0 due to deaths and stuff by about 1995, 1996. David Cameron was quite consensual as well, but there again he had to be because he had a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, so he had to work with Nick Clegg and co in order to get the agenda through of his government. Now his personal style might have been more consensual as well. He's sometimes been accused of being a bit laid back, but he also had to be that way. But interesting to see how Tony Blair or Mrs. Thatcher dealt with a situation like that. So the style of the Prime Minister is important, but also things like their majority size and what authority the Prime Minister has is also quite important for how they deal with their cabinets. So all these factors kind of swirl around. Now, what I want you to do is on this Cabinet Confidential, it says part 1 and 5 minutes of part 2. There are a number of questions. What is the view of ministers who have joined the cabinet? When Blair came to power in 1997, how and why did you wish to change how the cabinet was run compared to John Major? What was the cabinet and how did Blair government decide to effectively privatise the Bank of England? It then has a nice little bit about Harold Wilson and his cabinet. There's a nice bit about Mrs. Thatcher, John Major, and how they kind of dealt with their cabinets. You've then got this bit about the Millennium Dome under Tony Blair. It's often seen, or it's a very good example of a Prime Minister kind of ignoring his cabinet in many ways. So I want you to answer all those questions, and then I'm going to send you some other questions from Cabinet Confidential. Now, from the top of my head, I can't remember exactly which bits. I mean, I have a feeling it just carries on from that question 6. I know I've called it question 5A on the sheet for some reason. I'm sure with your brain power, you'll be able to find where it is on this programme. But there's some questions about how did James Callaghan deal with a very divided cabinet of the IMF loan. This is a really good example of a Prime Minister working with his cabinet to deal with a particular crisis, and it was a really big crisis in the mid-1970s. So this is also seen as a prime example of cabinet government in action. Um, we've then got the stuff about leaks from the cabinet. There's a couple of think questions as well regarding cabinet meetings and Blair and Major and stuff. And there's a nice think question put in there about Theresa May. So watch those bits of those cabinet confidentials. I said I can't remember exactly where these extra questions come from the top of my head. I think it just follows on from where the previous questions were. Again, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to find the relevant bits. But they should give you some really nice examples of prime ministers and cabinets and the differences in how different prime ministers deal with cabinets. Okay, once you've done that, it shouldn't take you all that long, that, to be completely honest with you. There's then a table which kind of formalises these these factors that affect the relationship between the cabinet and the prime minister. If you use the Edexcel textbook, I can't remember the page top of my head, but it's in the executive section. I'm sure you can be able to quickly find it. I put down the factors on the left-hand side. So the management skills of the prime minister, the prime minister's ability to set the agenda, popularity of the prime minister. Now this bit's not in the textbook, but have a think about it. If a prime minister is popular with the public, why might that affect their relationship with their cabinet? What might a popular prime minister be more likely to be able to do with their cabinet than an unpopular prime minister? Okay. You've got use of cabinet committees to make decisions, and then there's development of the prime minister's office and impact of wider events and situations. So what we're going to do is to use the information from the Edexcel textbook, but also supplement it with stuff that you've gained from watching those cabinet confidentials. You know, for example, I don't think the textbook, in terms of the one about crises, mentions this IMF loan, for example, in the 1970s with James Callaghan. So you could put that in, and how did that crisis affect relations with the cabinet? It might not mention other bits and pieces which you can put in. So you need to explain each of these, put examples in, and be thinking about how important these factors are and how they might change and alter over time. I mean, again, if you look at the Blair Prime Minister period, that's the right word, premiership, that's the word I was looking for. You know, at the beginning of his time, popular, dominated his cabinet. His cabinet were quite not very experienced because they hadn't been in government for a long time. He was able to dominate, but compare that to the end of his period, when obviously they'd all built up experience. His popularity had gone down and down and down following the Iraq War. Was Blair able to dominate his cabinet in quite the same way as he was at the beginning? Gordon Brown, at the end of his premiership, effectively almost ended his career, essentially. Whereas at the beginning of his premiership, Brown was quite important, but it wasn't quite as important as it was at the end in terms of influence. Mrs. Thatcher as well, you know, she was this dominant prime minister in many ways, but actually that backfired on her, and in the end it was the cabinet that stuck the knife in her, politically speaking, at the end. So these are not static, they alter and change. Okay, so again, use the textbook, use what's on the Cabinet Confidential, but also think about what's happened since. Think about Theresa May. You know, are there any examples of her being affected by these factors, or even Boris Johnson? You know, obviously he's dealing with this big crisis, which fits into this crisis point. In terms of his cabinet, his prime minister's office, there's this role of Dominic Cummings, isn't there, who's popped up. He's quite a significant figure. Again, there's a series about him, which I mentioned before, which is on iPlayer, which you might want to have a look at. So there are some of the factors that swirl around. So if you get an exam question along the lines of, I don't know, it'd be like, evaluate the view that the prime ministers no longer dominate their cabinets, for example. Okay, you'd have your three main paragraphs, wouldn't you? You'd have to think about, well, what kind of main point would I discuss in that type of essay? And what examples could I use? Actually, I quite like that question. So that's what you need to do. And because the question will be evaluate the prime minister no longer dominates, that suggests that prime ministers used to dominate. So there's that bit of change as well in that type of question. Actually, I did quite like that question. I can see that one coming your way. Okay, so I want you to do that. And then finally, because I'm some horrible, nasty, evil sadist, actually it's not finally, there's another thing I want you to do first. What shall I make to the next lesson? No, I'll do it now. Okay, once you've done that, actually no, we'll do this next business. So what I want you to do that, and then what I would like to do is there's a Politics Review article called I think I called it Politics Review 2020 or something like that. Cabinet and Prime Minister is basically like the last edition of Politics Review. It's on Teams. It's under Prime Minister and Cabinet. It gives a bit of an overview. It's not a very difficult article actually, but it gives a nice little overview about Cabinet and Prime Ministers. And I've just written out 8 or 9 questions on it. I'll tippy tap them up, and I'll send it out to you on an email. So can you get all that done, please, for around about Thursday? And on Thursday, we'll talk about Prime Ministers being presidential. And then what you need to do, then what we'll do is that if you look at the exam specification, you need to know in some detail about a couple of Prime Ministers. I'm going to look at John Major and Tony Blair in particular, but there are other ones as well. So I'll set all that work because next week's technically half term. So I'll tell you all that to do for the entire week. So when we come back, we should basically have done the vast majority of the executive stuff, which then this is nicely on track to do the Supreme Court, the European Union, and then we're done for the year. Okay, or the academic year anyway, not the year, because we'll be back in September. All right, so if you get all that done, please, for around about Thursday, and then I'll get the next one of these made Thursday or Friday, and I'll basically has all your half-term work, which you need to get on with. Okay, any problems, send me an email, and I'll leave you with that.